Actually, I am no longer working for Hackney, but I will go into that as we move through the presentation. So as you can see, my logo there is Dare to Dream Psychology, which is my own independent psychological practice. Let me see if we're going to move along. Okay, so a little bit about me. So I'm an educational child psychologist. I currently am in independent practice. A lot of my work at the moment is based on locum work, so that is supporting a number of different local authorities and doing some mental health support. So often when I'm asked, or when I tell someone I'm an educational psychologist, if they don't just assume that I'm actually a teacher that has decided to come up with a fancy title, not a lot of people tend to know what this role is. And actually, as an LJMU graduate myself, it was on this very day that I found out what this role was myself. So an educational psychologist typically works in local authorities. So we're not clinical based, maybe like more other psychologists. We tend to work for local authorities under the Department for Education, and we're heavily linked with schools, nurseries and colleges. And our work has 5 main branches. So that's consultation. So even though our remit is working with children and young people 0 to 25, obviously children and young people all come with parents or carers or guardians. So therefore we have a lot of consultations with the adults around them. So in the first instance, consultation, that's engaging with parents, educators, and any other professionals that may be supporting those children and young people. So that could be social care, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, so on and so forth. And it's through these consultations that we try to ascertain what is the area of need and what level of support that they will require from us as an EP, which is often used as an abbreviation for an educational psychologist. Within our work as well, we do assessment. So we conduct a variety of different assessments. So they may be cognitive assessments, so just to ascertain a child and person's sort of level of IQ, so to speak. But they may be play-based assessments, there may be dynamic assessments. And often we talk about assessment not necessarily needing to be a physical assessment kit. Assessment can even just be through conversation and through consultation. So there's a variety of different types of assessments that can be used. And we kind of see ourselves typically as being the more holistic practitioner within that sort of educational and development space. So we tend to be able to assess things around speech and language as well, even though we're not speech and language therapists. We can assess things around motor skills, even though we're not occupational therapists. We can test things around educational attainment and understanding as well. So we tend to be able to be holistic in that space and bring it all together, underpinned by a psychological perspective. We will then also recommend research-backed interventions, and in some cases we may actually deliver the interventions ourselves, and they can be with staff, they can be with the children themselves, they can also be with parents, so it just depends on what the level of need is. And they can be sometimes one-off interventions, they can run over a number of weeks. Again, it would depend on each case. Our role also is delivering a lot of training. So whether that's training again to staff, whether it's training, so there's a thing called emotional literacy support assistants. That's often training teaching assistants in schools to deliver therapeutic interventions. And we do this again on evidence-based practices. And a little bit like what was spoken earlier with the clinical psychology, we are scientist practitioners. So therefore that means that we add to the literature around educational psychology. So not only when we stop at the point of thesis, at the doctorate, whilst in the field, many of us will continue to do more research and disseminate that amongst colleagues and professionals, as well as keeping up to date with the latest research within the profession. So when we think about educational psychologists, we're mainly working with the SEND code of practice. So that's the special educational needs and disabilities practice. And there are 4 main areas of need that we look at. So that's cognition and learning difficulties, social and emotional and mental health needs, communication and interaction needs, and sensory and or physical needs. And I think actually listening to some of the previous speakers, you will see that there's a lot of overlap with our roles. There's probably things that all of us probably can do or understand to a certain extent before we then take that further into our maybe individual expertise. So cognition and learning difficulties is, you know, why is a child maybe not accessing the curriculum in the way that we would hope after adequate intervention from schools? And this may be because they have a specific learning difficulty, such as like dyslexia, dyscalculia, maybe they've got moderate learning difficulties, severe, or maybe even profound learning difficulties. And that might mean they need to be stepped out of mainstream education into more specialist provision. In our role, we don't tend to do diagnoses. The one sort of condition that we can diagnose is dyslexia, but that can cause a lot of contention depending on who you talk to. So I won't go into that into a lot of details. Some EPs will do it. Some EPs are adamant that they won't. It also matters about what local authority you work for as well, because some local authorities won't give out diagnoses. But that's not really the main aspect of our role. It's about support rather than diagnoses. So we work with diagnoses, we understand them, and we may sometimes recommend that people seek them from different professionals, but that's not our main role to be going to assess, to give a diagnosis. It's more about, okay, what's happening for this child or young person, and how can we adapt the things around this child or young person to support them. Social, emotional, mental health needs. So again, they might be at the level of disorder and diagnosed, so they might have diagnosed depression, or we may just notice that they are expressing low mood. As you can imagine, particularly now where there's a lot of information around neurodivergence, so attention, ADHD, autism, some areas that we work a lot in and with. Anxiety disorders, eating disorders, the list is endless, but it's just anything that ultimately has an impact on how a child or young person accesses or is not able to access school or whatever learning provision that they're placed in at that moment. And whilst we are not therapists, we can deliver therapeutic intervention. So we do understand therapy. And so we can run maybe sort of low-level, short courses of CBT informed therapeutic interventions where necessary sometimes. But if we then feel like actually this child or young person needs something more intense and above and beyond, that's when we would start to say maybe they need referrals into CAMS, or whether the school has counsellors there as well, and they would maybe take on that role instead. Again, with communication and interaction needs, so understanding maybe why they're not understanding language, processing language, why their language is not developing at the rate in which we would expect it to. So that might be because they have a specific language and communication need, or again, maybe that's a child or young person who has autism. And then in sensory and physical needs, so this is around children maybe who are visually impaired, hearing impaired, who may also have physical disabilities. So again, cognitively, they may be doing well in school, but maybe because of a physical disability, that's having an impact on how they access certain spaces, how they navigate the room, or how they utilize certain tools within the classroom. And often we'll see that maybe have an effect on their social and mental well-being as well, in terms of confidence. So again, we're able to support staff with that too. And then, as I said earlier, because we work from 0 to 25, so we go into that early adulthood, there's another framework that we tend to look at as well, is that preparing for adulthood framework. And we use this for typically when a child usually gets to about year 9, so when they're around 14, 15, we start to think, okay, what are we hoping for them as they start to move out of secondary school, out of being supported so heavily by their parents, and we're stepping into adulthood. So then we start to think about how are their needs going to affect them in the world of employment, or how are their needs going to affect them in terms of independent living, whether that's going off to uni, whether that's living on their own or house sharing, how we make sure that they continue to connect with the community. Because often once you're not in school, it can be hard to maybe to find friends and connect with friends, or find a community that you have similar interests with, and again how that will have an effect on their overall health. So this is where we start to support them with that, and this is sometimes where we have that overlap between children and then adult services, which can sometimes be a bit of a nightmare when children and young people get to around about 18. So thinking about how to become an educational child psychologist then. So this is a little bit similar to what was explained to you in the clinical psychology. Again, it is a 3-year professional doctorate, and that is made up of in-person learning and then being on placement. So you'll ultimately end up doing the role, particularly from years 2 and 3. You will do more classroom learning in your first year, but by 2nd and 3rd year, you're out there, you have your caseload, obviously heavily supervised and on a smaller scale, but you are doing the role of an EP at that point. slightly different is that we are not salaried. So we tend to get a bursary throughout the course. And it's also funded by the Department of Education. So it's one of the few things that you don't have to pay back. The bursary, you would have to look into that because it changes each year. They keep kind of going up and down. And also if you're doing it in London compared to outside of London, the cost of the bursary can vary as well. It's not a lot of money. It's usually somewhere between like 12 to 15,000 pounds. So often people will maybe still live at home or with partners that will help to subsidize that. There do tend to be some, very few though, salaried placements. They're not that in abundance, so not many people get them. And there's also pros and cons because it's also still not paid very well. Because you are now salaried, you are subject to tax and paying council tax and things like that, which for some people, they end up saying actually is not worth it for the extra, maybe sometimes £5,000 that actually being on the bursary, whereby technically you're unemployed, you hand in your certificate and say, I don't pay council tax for these 3 years. You know, you can maybe access some things like free prescriptions and stuff because you're technically a student and unemployed. So sometimes you have to work out which one would work best for you and your circumstances. But again, like the clinical psychology, it's a very, and I think the forensic psychology course, it's a very competitive course to get onto. So currently there's 13 universities across England that do, with including Wales and Northern Ireland, that run the course. Most courses have about 15 spaces on them. So again, not a lot. There are a few of the courses now that are expanding up into the 20s, but again, that's not all of them. So the competition is high. I know for myself, I think it was my 4th application before I actually managed to get on the doctorate. So there's a lot happening between undergrad and getting onto that doctorate. Most people, I think, similar to what was mentioned in the clinical psychology, probably will at least apply twice. I don't think I know anyone that's got on them the first time. Not to say that nobody hasn't, but I don't think I know anyone that has managed to get on in their first application. In order to get onto the course, you need to have a BPS accredited undergraduate, which you are because you're doing it at LJMU. Or if you didn't have that to begin with, then you can do a conversion master's. And then after that, they say at least 1 year full-time equivalent experience. But this is the bit where I'd say most people come with a lot more than 1 year experience. So again, as been mentioned earlier, all experience is really important before you get onto the doctorate. And when I look back at my experience, most people this was their second career. So a lot of people were already teachers because historically the route into this profession was that you had to be a teacher. It's no longer, but that tends to be still the quite common experience prior to the doctorate. So a lot of people were teachers, Senkos, assistant psychologists, youth workers, support workers. Some people have already been a speech and language therapist, may have already got CBT qualifications. So a lot of the people that come onto the course are very, very experienced and knowledgeable, which obviously helps when being on that course. So I wouldn't be discouraged if you've got your 1 year experience and you don't get on. As I say, the competition is high. And if you've got 1 year experience, you're likely going up against someone who's maybe been a teacher for 5 years. So definitely understands that educational space. There's a little bit of a list here around the application process. So usually applications tend to open around September, so they would be open already now. You need to get in your application and your deadline and your references in by October. And then usually in the sort of March time is when they do interviews. And then after that, you'll get your offer sort of late March, ready for the September start. Yeah. So to give you a bit of an idea about my route. So I was where you all sat. I did my applied psychology degree at John Moores. I left and became a primary school teaching assistant, but with a main focus on special educational needs. I did that for a few years. In that time, I did actually apply for the doctorate once and didn't get on. So I was like, okay, what am I going to do instead? And if you know anything about being a teaching assistant, a wonderful job, but not well paid. So I said, right, need some money. And I also thought, maybe having a plan B, so to speak, might work for me. So I then went and did my PGCE in secondary education so that I became a A-level psychology teacher. I did so between the years of 2016 and 18, I had a bit of a flitter. So I went into my first post as an A-level teacher, decided I don't like this. And then also was in that period where I'd applied again for the doctorate I hadn't got on, and started wondering maybe I should do clinical psychology, because somewhere at that point I'd found out that clinical psychology had more options, more placements than educational psychology, because there's been a few more universities doing it now than when I was initially applying. But I didn't have any clinical experience. So that's when I got a role in CAMS, being a children and young persons wellbeing practitioner in training. This is, if you've heard about IAPT, it was quite new. It was a new role run out by IAPT. But I realised for me personally, whilst working in CAMS, that clinical space wasn't necessarily for me. And actually, I did really want to be an EP still. And again, I took a step back out, went back to teaching whilst applying for the doctorate. And on that occasion, I managed to get on. So then I did my doctorate in education and child psychology at the University of Manchester from 2018 to 2021. And upon qualifying, I moved to London. And since being in London, I've worked for 2 different local authorities. So I worked for Lambeth, and then I worked for Hackney as a main grade EP. And then last year, I made a decision to move from local authority work into independent practice. And that's what I'm doing for myself now. So it's still all quite new. And so now I work for myself, referrals come into me, but it also allows me to have a bit more flexibility in how I deliver my role. So these are some images of some of the things that I now do as an EP, which you can do in local authority, but you get more scope to do different things when you're doing it for yourself. So for example, last week, I was actually doing a talk for a mental health charity for Black History Month around the impact of culture and representation. Because I do a lot of work remotely, like this lady here who's got her legs up and a beautiful scenery, I can actually work wherever I like for a lot of the time, which means I don't have to be in one city or one space. And I think particularly post-COVID, a lot of people, that appeals to a lot of people. So for example, I'm thinking about going away over January. I don't have to worry about getting annual leave because me and my laptop will go and I will do my work there. So that flexibility has also been amazing. I do, as I mentioned earlier, do a lot of locum work for local authorities. So that's basically like backlog of work that local authorities are struggling to get through. And that's through their education and healthcare process, the statutory work. And so I do that all virtually. So I do my assessments virtually and I write my reports virtually. And I do that for a number of local authorities. And so there's one thing to say about this role. There's a lot of exciting things in this role, but there's a lot of report writing, a lot. So if you don't like writing reports, I don't know if this is going to be the profession for you, but there is a lot of report writing. So I do spend a lot of my time writing reports. It's actually what I've been doing in the background whilst the rest of you have been listening to this talk. I run reflective practice sessions. So that's kind of a bit like group supervision. And more recently, I've been taking on some support for a therapeutic mental health home for young people from about 18 to 25. So less connected with education, but more sitting in that social, emotional, mental well-being and that preparing for adulthood framework. And that's been really exciting because it means I'm working more along the medical model, which has been, quite different to stuff you would do in local authority. And I receive supervision, so we have to receive supervision. So to be an actual registered psychologist, you tend to need to be accredited by a particular body. I'm not sure if the clinical psychology is the same one. There may or there may not be. I'm not 100% sure, but we are registered by the Healthcare and Professionals Council, which they set out a set of standards and requirements that we must follow. And one of them is that we must receive regular supervision. So I receive supervision where I get to talk about the work that I'm doing and how I'm working through that. But I also deliver supervision. So I supervise different professionals in different roles. So sometimes it's not EP, sometimes I might supervise. Like I say, I've been supervising some of the staff within the mental health facility. Sometimes you might supervise teachers as well. So we can use our supervisory skills in a variety of different ways. And I think that's really most of it, really. So I don't know if we come to the end, maybe say if there are any questions.